A warm evening wind rolled over the small town of Ashwick, Alabama, carrying with it the faint smell of pine, earth, and something else no one could quite name. The year was 1852, but the people of Ashwick would remember it only as the year shadows began to follow them home. It started with whispers, strange noises near the creek, figures seen at dusk that moved in perfect synchronization, doors creaking open in the dead of night with no wind to blame. No one imagined the source of it all was just two girls. Two identical sisters who walked hand in hand everywhere, their pale faces unreadable, their voices soft and synchronized like a single echo split in two. People said the twins had always been odd. They had a way of staring too long, listening too carefully, showing up where they shouldn't be. But oddities were nothing new in rural towns. What unsettled folks was the silence that followed them. Animals stopped braying, wind stopped blowing, even the insects seemed to pause. Mothers clutched their children closer when the girls passed. Men tipped their hats but avoided eye contact. The twins never reacted, they simply watched, as though studying every soul they encountered. The first disappearance was easy to dismiss. A farmhand who liked to drink, wander, and forget where he'd been. But the second disappearance gnawed at the town's nerves. And the third made even the bravest men start locking their doors before sundown. By the seventh, the town's heartbeat trembled with fear. These weren't accidents. These weren't coincidences. Something, or someone, was hunting. Yet no matter who vanished, one detail remained constant. The last place anyone saw them alive was near the old Miller farmhouse, where the twins lived in eerie, unsettling quiet. For months, people tried to ignore the truth forming at the edges of their minds. But fear has a way of sharpening senses, and soon it became impossible not to notice how the sisters walked the roads only at night, how their whispers carried strangely far in the dark, how lanterns flickered when they drew near. Folks started avoiding their path altogether, crossing to the opposite side of the road, pretending not to see the thin smiles the girls wore as they passed. And still, people kept disappearing. 17 souls swallowed by the dark, leaving behind nothing but questions that settled like dust over Ashwick's trembling heart. It wasn't until the night a blood-soaked stranger staggered into town, barely breathing, that the truth finally stepped into the light. His eyes were wild, his body torn, and with the last breaths trapped in his chest, he whispered a single sentence that froze the entire town where it stood, a sentence that would lead Ashwick into its darkest hour and seal the twins' place in American history forever. Rumors about the twins' birth spread through Ashwick long before the girls could even speak, carried from porch to porch by shaken voices that struggled to explain what they had witnessed that night. It was the summer of 1835 when a violent storm rolled across southern Alabama with a fury no one had seen in years, tearing through fields, shaking windows, and cracking open the night sky with blinding flashes. The Miller farmhouse stood at the edge of the woods, trembling beneath the storm's weight as lightning crawled across the clouds like glowing veins. Inside, midwives hurried between rooms, their lanterns swaying while the mother's screams rose and fell with the thunder. People swore the storm grew louder each time she cried out, as if the sky itself were answering her. When the first girl finally came into the world, the midwives expected the usual panic of a newborn's first breath, but what they heard instead made them freeze where they stood. The infant didn't cry. She let out a sound closer to a breathy giggle, soft and delicate, completely out of place against the storm's violence. Before they could recover from the unease creeping up their spines, the second girl arrived just minutes later, and her entrance was even stranger. Her eyes snapped open the moment she emerged, dark and unblinking, fixating on the lantern light as though she were already aware of the world around her. Then she too let out that same eerie, breathy laugh, perfectly matching the first girl's tone as if rehearsed. By the time the storm passed, the midwives refused to stay in the house a moment longer. They whispered to each other that something wasn't right about those babies, something unnatural in the way they seemed to breathe in unison, blink in unison, and turn their tiny heads at the same time toward any sound. Word spread quickly in a town that clung to superstition as tightly as its faith, and soon the story twisted into something even more unsettling. Some swore they saw lightning strike the Miller roof the exact moment the twins' first laughter echoed through the house. Others claimed the mother went pale and silent after seeing them, refusing to hold them until morning. The father, a troubled man with a reputation for cruelty, took one look at them before muttering that the storm hadn't brought daughters into his home, it had brought omens. As days passed, the townsfolk continued to talk, unable to decide whether the girls were blessed or cursed, but all agreed on one thing: no twins born under such a storm could ever grow up to be ordinary. When the twins were 7, the town of Ashwick learned that childhood innocence could wear a mask sharper than any adult cruelty. That summer had been long and unbearably hot, the kind of heat that made tempers short and kept children outside searching for any distraction. The Miller girls rarely played with others, but on that particular day, they were seen near the creek with a neighbor boy named Eli Turner, a quiet child who often wandered alone. No one thought much of it at first. Children explored those woods constantly, chasing frogs and skipping stones across the water. But what made people look twice was how the girls walked on either side of him, holding his arms as if guiding him somewhere, their faces unreadable, their heads tilted just slightly in mirrored curiosity. Hours later, when Eli didn't return home for supper, his mother began calling for him across the fields, her voice carrying through the thick evening air. When night fell and the boy still hadn't appeared, lanterns lit up across Ashwick as families joined the frantic search. The twins were spotted standing at the edge of the tree line, their nightgowns fluttering in the breeze, watching the commotion with wide, unblinking eyes. When asked where Eli had gone, they simply pointed toward the creek without uttering a word. The search party eventually found him at the bottom of a shallow embankment, lying still among the roots and wet leaves. The official explanation was swift and simple: the boy must have slipped, hit his head, and drowned in only a few inches of water. It was a tragedy, the town agreed, but no one wanted to believe anything worse. Still, whispers began to spread almost immediately. Some of the men who discovered the body insisted Eli's injuries didn't look like a fall. His arms bore strange, almost symmetrical marks, and the mud showed signs of small footprints circling where he'd been found. Others reported seeing the twins standing nearby earlier that day, their hands clasped behind their backs, their pale faces blank as Eli tried to pull away from them. But whenever anyone attempted to question the girls, they answered in soft, matching tones that they had only wanted to show him a secret hiding spot. They never cried, never expressed confusion, never displayed the fear that children typically felt when confronted with death. Rumors hardened into quiet certainty among the older townsfolk, though no one dared voice it out loud. Something about that day didn't sit right. Something about the twins' calmness chilled even the bravest searcher. Yet with no proof and no one willing to accuse 2 7-year-old girls, the matter was buried along with Eli. But from that moment on, families began to watch their children more closely whenever the Miller twins were near. As the twins grew older, the strangeness that had once been brushed off as childhood peculiarity deepened into something far more unsettling. By their early teens, they had withdrawn almost entirely from the rhythms of Ashwick life, appearing in town only when necessary and vanishing back into the Miller farmhouse the moment they were done. Most children their age sought company, laughter, and mischief, but the sisters seemed to exist in a world carved out exclusively for two. They rarely spoke to anyone except each other, and when they did, their voices carried the same steady cadence, as though one mind powered both tongues. Townsfolk whispered that you never truly spoke to one sister without the other listening, even if she stood across the yard or inside another room. Their silence was never the quiet of shyness but the heavy, deliberate quiet of observers taking note of everything around them. The farmhouse itself mirrored their isolation. Once a lively place filled with the noise of chores, arguments, and the day's bustle, it had fallen eerily still. Their father's temper had worsened over the years, and the harshness of the household seemed to darken the air that hung over the land. The girls kept to the attic or disappeared into the woods behind the property for hours, moving like shadows beneath the trees. People who walked past swore they heard faint murmuring carried on the breeze, and sometimes the same voice overlapping itself with perfect precision. The deeper they retreated from the world, the stronger the bond between them became, as if the boundary separating the two had dissolved completely. Neighbors who tried to offer help or check on the family never stayed long. The inside of the farmhouse felt wrong in a way no one could articulate: absence of warmth, absence of sound, absence of any sign that the twins lived like ordinary girls. Their room, glimpsed only once by a visiting aunt, was said to contain 2 small beds pushed together so closely they might as well have been one, and crude carvings etched into the walls in mirrored patterns. The aunt left before sundown and never visited again. What troubled the town most was not the girls' reclusiveness but the way they watched people whenever they did appear. Their eyes followed movements with unnerving focus, their expressions neither friendly nor hostile, simply intent. They would stand side by side, their shoulders almost touching, their breathing synchronized, their gazes fixed as though cataloguing every human behavior they witnessed. The distance they created was not the distance of fear or discomfort, it felt more like study, like preparation. And over time, even the most dismissive townsfolk began to sense that the girls were not isolated because they were shy or unwanted. They were isolated because they preferred it. They were comfortable only with each other, safe only in the strange, impenetrable world they built between them, and the rest of Ashwick was nothing more than a landscape they moved through when necessary, never a place they belonged. The arrival of the stranger seemed at first like nothing more than the usual rhythm of life in a rural Alabama town. Travelers often passed through Ashwick, drawn by seasonal work or the promise of steady pay on the farms scattered along the county roads. That year, the Millers needed extra help, as their fields had grown wild from neglect and their father's health was beginning to falter under years of bitterness and rage. So when a lean, sunburned worker named Jonah Briggs stopped by the property offering labor in exchange for room and board, the father agreed without hesitation. Jonah was the kind of man who carried his life in a single canvas sack, accustomed to drifting from place to place with little more than the strength in his hands. He wasn't afraid of hard work, nor was he easily rattled, but the moment he stepped onto the Miller land, he felt an unease he couldn't properly explain. The air seemed too still, the woods too quiet, and the house too shadowed for a farm that was supposedly struggling to keep up with chores. Jonah first noticed the twins when he headed to the barn at dawn on his second morning. They were standing by the fence, their identical white dresses brushing the tops of their ankles, their hair neatly braided, their eyes following him without blinking. He lifted a hand in greeting, but they only tilted their heads in perfect unison, as if considering him. Their silence stretched on long enough that Jonah felt compelled to look away. He told himself they were just shy girls, perhaps sheltered or peculiar, but as the days passed, he realized they were always watching. No matter where he worked, feeding the animals, repairing the fence, mending the roof, he would glance toward the house or the tree line and see the twins standing side by side, still as carved figures, observing him as though he were the one under inspection. At night, the feeling grew worse. Jonah slept in a small shed just off the barn, and more than once he woke to the sound of quiet footsteps outside, too light to belong to their father. Once, just before sunrise, he swore he saw two thin silhouettes pass by the window, pausing as if listening to his breathing. When he mentioned it to the old man over breakfast, the father brushed it off, muttering that the girls liked to wander when the house grew too stifling. But Jonah sensed something else in the man's eyes, a flicker of fear disguised as irritation. The tension came to a breaking point a week later when Jonah failed to show up for work one hot afternoon. By sundown, he had vanished entirely, leaving behind his sack, his tools, and any trace of his departure. The town believed he had simply moved on like all drifters eventually did, but a few neighbors remembered seeing the twins that morning, walking ahead of him into the woods behind the farmhouse, their hands clasped behind their backs, their faces expressionless as they led him deeper into the trees. The visit from the local doctor was never supposed to be anything more than routine, just a simple check on the Miller family after word spread that their father had taken ill again. Dr. Whitlock had known the Millers for years, long enough to understand the tension that lived inside their walls, but he still believed it his duty to help when sickness struck a home. He arrived one humid morning, medical bag in hand, expecting to find the twins somewhere outside as they often were. Instead, the yard was empty, the fields silent, and the farmhouse door slightly ajar as if someone had forgotten to close it behind them. The doctor stepped inside and immediately felt the shift in the air. The house was colder than the outside heat should have allowed, and there was a heavy stillness that pressed against him the deeper he walked in. Dust floated in the light slicing through the windows, and the usual sounds of a lived-in home were absent, no movement upstairs, no voices, no footsteps. He found the father resting in bed, pale and drained, though not as sick as rumors had made him. Their conversation was brief, the old man irritable and dismissive, insisting the twins were around somewhere and that the house had simply become too quiet for his liking. But the doctor sensed something else beneath his gruff words, something like exhaustion mixed with dread. As Dr. Whitlock examined him, he kept catching the man glancing toward the doorway as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. When he asked if the girls had been helping him during his illness, the father looked away and muttered that they kept to themselves, more than ever before. After finishing his assessment, the doctor walked through the house, partly out of habit and partly out of unease he couldn't quite shake. The floorboards creaked under his steps, groaning like they resented being disturbed. As he passed the dining room, he paused. From somewhere beneath the floor, faint and rhythmic, came the sound of scratching. Not the frantic scratching of an animal trapped between walls, but a slow, measured scrape, as if someone or something was dragging a hand or tool across wood. Dr. Whitlock froze, his breath catching in his throat. He crouched down, pressed his ear to the floor, and held himself perfectly still. The scratching continued for a moment longer, then stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie quiet that felt heavier than before. A chill crawled down his spine as he straightened up. He knew better than to pry. Whatever secrets lived in that house were not his to uncover, especially with the strange twins lingering somewhere unseen. Without another word, he gathered his things and left, offering only a curt farewell to the father. He did not mention the sound beneath the floor, not to the man and not to anyone in town afterward. But from that day on, whenever he passed by the Miller property, he felt the same cold pressure in his chest, a silent warning that whatever lay hidden in that farmhouse had been alive, listening, and waiting. As the months passed, the disappearances began forming a pattern that no one in Ashwick wanted to acknowledge. At first, it was easy enough to dismiss the missing drifters as men who had simply moved on, the way wanderers often did when the work dried up or the nights grew too cold. But when people who actually lived in or near the town began vanishing without explanation, fear took root beneath every doorstep. A young woman who sold eggs along the roadside never made it home one evening. An elderly couple living 3 miles south of the Millers' property was found to have left their dinner table set, their chairs pulled out, as though they had stood up mid-meal and stepped into thin air. A pair of farmhands from a neighboring plantation disappeared on the same night, their horses later found grazing near the creek as if nothing unusual had happened. By the time the 17th person went missing, the entire community had become a place of locked doors, shuttered windows, and restless nights. What struck people as the most chilling was that every trail, no matter who vanished or where they had last been seen, seemed to lead back, in one way or another, to the land where the Miller twins lived. Sometimes it was a footprint near their property line, sometimes it was a discarded object discovered just beyond their barn, and sometimes it was merely the direction someone had been walking before they disappeared. Folks whispered that the woods behind the Miller house had turned wrong, that the trees muffled sound too easily, that the ground felt soft in places where it shouldn't, as if freshly disturbed. Children were forbidden to play anywhere near that stretch of land, and even grown men avoided it after dark. Yet the twins remained untouched by suspicion in any official sense. They drifted through town on rare occasions, their pale faces emotionless, walking so close together their shoulders brushed with every step. People noticed how they watched everyone with that same unsettling calmness, eyes following movement with unwavering precision, as though they were measuring something silent and hidden beneath each person's skin. Women crossed the street to avoid them. Men took off their hats in uneasy greeting but kept conversations short. The girls never lingered, never changed their pace, never broke the expression that seemed carved into their features. They were becoming phantoms in plain sight, always there, always watching, never speaking unless spoken to. Behind closed doors, families whispered theories too disturbing to share in the daylight. Some believed the twins lured the missing into the woods, using their soft voices and strange unity to disarm them. Others thought the girls were protecting something hidden deep within the farmhouse or buried beneath the earth. But what frightened the townsfolk most was the realization that whatever was happening, it was no longer random. The disappearances were deliberate, orchestrated, and carried out with a calm precision that felt inhuman. No one could prove it, but everyone felt it. The Miller twins were connected to the darkness swallowing Ashwick, and the town was running out of time to understand how or why. Sheriff Thomas Talbot had spent nearly 2 decades keeping order in Ashwick, and in all that time he had never encountered a mystery that gnawed at him the way these disappearances did. He was a practical man, grounded in logic, slow to anger, and slower still to jump to conclusions, but even he could no longer ignore the weight of dread settling over the town. Every missing person report circled back to the same unsettling fact: all paths, whether literal or circumstantial, ended near the Miller property. At first, Talbot resisted the idea. 2 young girls being involved in something so sinister felt impossible, almost absurd. But the evidence kept nudging him, subtle yet persistent, like a whisper at the back of his mind that refused to fade. He began by revisiting the places where the missing had last been seen, retracing their final steps, examining tracks in the dirt, broken branches, and abandoned belongings. It didn't take long before he noticed a disturbing pattern. The trails never faded, rather, they were interrupted, stopping abruptly as if the people had simply vanished into thin air. Animals would have left signs of struggle, footprints, or drag marks. But there was nothing. Just silence and the faint, unmistakable feeling of being watched. On more than one occasion, Talbot felt the hair on his neck stand up as he stood near the edge of the Miller woods, a prickling sensation crawling across his skin as though unseen eyes tracked his every movement. He would glance over his shoulder and catch a glimpse of the twins standing far off near the tree line, their hands clasped politely in front of them, their expressions blank, their eyes too steady for girls their age. The sheriff tried speaking to them once, stopping by the farmhouse under the guise of checking in on their father. The twins greeted him at the door, their voices soft and synchronized, offering no emotion beyond a polite hello. When he asked about the missing workers, their heads tilted at the same precise angle, their brows barely furrowing as they answered his questions with a calmness that unsettled him more than anger or fear ever could. They claimed they had not seen anyone, had heard nothing unusual, had no idea why the town was so frightened. But Talbot noticed the way their pupils widened ever so slightly when he mentioned specific names, and the fleeting smile one of the girls suppressed when he asked whether they ever walked in the woods after dark. After that visit, Talbot stopped trying to deny the truth forming inside him. He began keeping detailed notes, sketching timelines, and marking maps, each new disappearance tightening the circle around the Miller farm. Still, he struggled with the enormity of the realization: if the twins were involved, how were they doing it? They had no weapons, no strength compared to grown adults, no reason anyone could understand. And yet the evidence kept accumulating, undeniable and cold. Talbot did not yet know what lived inside that farmhouse or what waited in the woods behind it, but he knew this much: the Miller twins were not merely witnesses to the darkness creeping over Ashwick, they were at the center of it, and the town's safety depended on uncovering the truth before they struck again. The man who stumbled out of the Miller woods that night barely resembled anything human by the time he reached the edge of town. His clothes were torn, smeared with dirt and blood, and his breaths came out in sharp, ragged bursts as if each inhale scraped against broken ribs. No one knew his name at first. He had arrived in Ashwick only days before, looking for work like so many others who drifted through. But unlike the others who had vanished without a trace, he had made it out, though by the look of him, it was a miracle he had survived even a few steps beyond whatever horror he had escaped. He collapsed near the old well at the center of town, drawing the attention of a group of men leaving a late evening gathering. They rushed to his side, shouting for help, while the stranger clutched at their sleeves with trembling fingers, his wide eyes locked on the direction of the Miller property as if expecting something to come after him. When they lifted him, he screamed a raw, animal sound that turned every head and emptied every lantern-lit doorway. The doctor arrived moments later, pushing through the crowd to kneel beside the man. The stranger tried to speak, but at first, only choked gasps emerged from his swollen lips. His body bore marks no one could explain: thin, precise cuts across his arms and back, bruises shaped in strange, deliberate patterns, and deep indentations around his wrists and ankles that looked like he had been bound for days. One of the men swore he smelled earth clinging to the stranger's skin, damp and cold, as though he had been kept underground. The stranger fought to rise again, pointing frantically toward the dark line of trees beyond the fields. His voice cracked as he tried to form words, but nothing clear came out until the doctor pressed a cup of water to his mouth and begged him to speak slowly. What finally escaped his lips sent a wave of fear through everyone gathered. His voice was barely audible, broken and fading, yet the words cut through the air with the precision of a blade. He whispered about 2 shadows moving together, about hands that gripped without mercy, about soft voices whispering in perfect unison in the darkness. He spoke of chains beneath the floor, of footsteps that never made sound, of being watched even in total blackness by eyes that caught the faintest glimmer of candlelight. The doctor tried to steady him, asking who had done this, but the man only repeated the same haunting phrase over and over, the sisters, the two of them. Before anyone could ask more, his body went limp, his chest rising only once more before falling still. Men looked at one another in stunned silence, their faces drained of color. There had been rumors, suspicions, uneasy glances exchanged over dinner tables, but this was the first time someone had returned from the Miller Woods alive long enough to speak. And though his words were fragmented and desperate, they confirmed what many had feared for months. Something unimaginable was happening behind the walls of that farmhouse and beneath the roots of those trees, and the thing responsible was not a beast or a vagrant or a madman. It was something far stranger, far quieter, and far more deliberate, an evil bound not by chains or weapons, but by blood, unity, and a darkness that moved with two matching sets of feet. The night the sheriff finally gathered a group of armed men to raid the Miller property, the air felt charged with a tension so sharp it seemed to cut through the darkness itself. No one spoke as they rode toward the farmhouse, even the horses seemed uneasy, shifting on their hooves as though they sensed what waited ahead. Sheriff Talbot had spent weeks assembling evidence, breaking through the town's fear and denial, until he could no longer justify inaction. The dying stranger's final words had settled like ice in the hearts of every man present, and now, with lanterns swaying and rifles gripped tightly, they prepared to confront the truth that had been growing like a sickness in the woods. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, its porch sagging in the moonlight. It looked empty, abandoned even, but Talbot knew better. He signaled for the men to spread out, his voice hushed, his heart pounding with each step. When they pushed open the door, it didn't creak, it groaned, as though resisting their entry. Inside, the house was colder than the night air, shadows pooling in corners as if they had weight. Dust coated every surface, yet there were signs of recent use. A chair slightly pulled from the table, a half-burnt candle, a piece of fabric snagged on a nail. The men moved carefully, lanterns raised, scanning each room. The oppressive silence was broken only by their breathing and the faint rustling of the old structure. It wasn't until they reached the back of the house that Talbot noticed the uneven floorboards, one slightly darker than the others. Beneath it, he felt a faint draft, cold, damp, and carrying with it the unmistakable scent of earth and decay. With a steadying breath, Talbot pried the board loose. A gush of cold air burst upward, and beneath the floor lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The walls were lined with claw marks, some fresh enough that the wood still curled at the edges. The men hesitated, but Talbot forced himself forward, lantern raised high. As they stepped into the hidden chamber, the lantern light fell upon chains bolted into the walls, splintered beams, scraps of clothing, and dried stains that needed no explanation. It was unmistakably a prison, one crafted with meticulous care and used far too often. The air was thick with the smell of iron and damp soil, but beneath it lingered something else, something that made every man's skin crawl, a faint, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, echoing through the tunnels that branched off into darkness. Talbot felt a chill crawl up his spine as he realized the twins had not simply been killing. They had been keeping people alive, hidden, restrained, and waiting for reasons only they understood. Before he could investigate further, a sudden noise echoed above them, light footsteps moving across the floorboards with disturbing calmness. Not hurried. Not panicked. Just steady, synchronized steps, circling the opening like predators closing in. The men froze, horror settling deep in their bones as they understood that whatever they had found below was only the beginning, and the twins had known they were coming all along. Here is *** key point number 10 explained in 450 words, without any subheadings or ending sentence ***. As the final pieces of the mystery locked into place, the entire state found itself caught in a feverish blend of dread, fascination, and disbelief. Rumors spread faster than the authorities could control, twisting the truth into something even darker than reality. Some claimed the sisters had carved symbols into the trees around their cabin, while others swore they heard chanting in the woods the night before the cabin burned. What was undeniable, however, was the chilling silence that settled over the region, a silence that followed every whisper of their names. The twins were no longer viewed as mere criminals, they had become a living legend of terror, a story traded in hushed tones around campfires and kitchen tables. The aftermath grew even more complicated as residents began reporting strange occurrences around the abandoned homestead. Animals refused to stray near the property, and travelers swore they saw figures moving inside the ruins at night. Whether out of genuine fear or the intoxicating thrill of shared paranoia, the community convinced itself that the land itself had absorbed the twins' cruelty. The authorities attempted to dismantle these beliefs, insisting there was nothing supernatural about the case, but their words carried little weight compared to the chilling aura surrounding the location. The legend only intensified when a group of treasure hunters dug near the property and discovered a locked metal box buried several feet underground. Inside were letters, sketches, and coded notes believed to be written by the twins. Their content was so unnerving that local officials refused to release them to the public. Yet select pages leaked, feeding the storm. Some writings hinted at more crimes yet to be discovered, while others seemed to document their descent into obsession, revealing patterns of manipulation, delusion, and violence. Historians and psychologists from across the country descended upon Alabama to study the case, each trying to unravel how two young women from a quiet, isolated community could evolve into something so ruthless. Yet no single theory could satisfy the collective hunger for answers. The twins defied categorization, their motives as tangled as the dense woods that once concealed their crimes. In the years that followed, imitation stories emerged, none confirmed, all deeply unsettling, suggesting the sisters' legacy had inspired new acts of violence. Whether coincidence or consequence, it cemented the twins as a cautionary symbol in American folklore. Even today, long after the land has been reclaimed by nature, the region holds its breath whenever someone mentions the old case, as though speaking their names might stir something long buried, something waiting just beneath the surface.